Hello again, everyone. Thanks for joining us once again here at the Christian Educational Ministries Weekend Bible Study. Hope you had an outstanding week, and I hope you look forward to Friday evening as much as I do. Last week, we finished up chapter 2, and by this time, Esther had been the queen of Persia for several years. But looking back, when we reflect on the last chapter and about the process Esther had to go through leading up to her coronation, it may give readers pause about what all took place. There might be even a bit of uneasiness about what transpired. I mean, how could a nice, innocent young Jewish girl like Esther become part of a harem of all things? This reeks of immorality, doesn't it? How could God allow such a thing to happen to Esther? And it wasn't just Esther who may have been adversely affected. There were scores of young girls, if not hundreds, of innocent virgins who were gathered up by the authorities and taken to the king's harem. They must have been petrified, being taken from their families, not knowing what was going to happen to them. And this wasn't just a beauty pageant that they signed up for and could opt out of if they didn't like what was going on. I'm pretty sure Mordecai and Esther weren't sitting around one day reading the local paper when Mordecai said something like this to Esther. "Hey, Esther, I see here that the king is having a beauty contest to see who might be the next queen. What do you think about entering to see if you might qualify?" And I don't think it happened that way. No, Esther was taken by coercion, and so were all the rest of the girls. They were there whether they liked it or not. And Esther didn't have any idea she would be chosen to be the next queen. Now, granted, Haggai made sure she was given special treatment, but there was no guarantee that she would be made queen. Had she not become queen, she would have been relegated to the burgeoning stable of concubines for the rest of her life. And I think it's important for us to keep that in perspective. Esther didn't volunteer for this. She was drafted, as it were, into the king's service. And with God's help, she did the best she could in light of what could have turned out to be a loathsome life, just being another one of the hundreds of harem girls. But one might continue to ask, why did God allow her to be in a harem? Wasn't that a bit unseemly? Well, a lot of unseemly things happen throughout the Bible, but God can make those things turn out for the good. Why did Joseph have to be sold as a slave and spend a couple of years in prison? And why did Daniel and his friends have to be taken captive and be made eunuchs? Why did Paul have to be shipwrecked and stoned and beaten and ultimately imprisoned and executed in Rome? Why did any number of things that transpired have to happen? Well, it's not that they had to happen, it's just that they did happen. And God works things out the way He wants them to work. All manner of injustices and bad situations happen to our Bible heroes. In fact, the entire Bible is replete with dysfunctional families and individuals who sin mightily along the way. But that doesn't mean God put His seal of approval on sinful behaviors or bad situations. But He almost always works through humans, and humans are always imperfect. And because of that, we should be comforted and encouraged because the people we read about in the Bible all had the problems with which we can identify. All right, let's get to chapter 3. We're introduced to Haman in this chapter, and we'll soon see that he was a self-absorbed narcissist of the highest order who viscerally hated Mordecai. But not just Mordecai. He hated all the Jews. Verse 1. After these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha, an Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than that of all the other nobles. Verse 2. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. Then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for he had told them that he was a Jew. Now that verse right there indicates that there was an air of anti-Semitism at play in the community. Read it again. Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for he had told them he was a Jew. Couple that with Mordecai's insistence that Esther keep her Jewish ethnicity a secret, and you can be pretty sure there must have been some contempt for those who were known to be Jews. Verse 5. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet, having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. Okay, there's way more going on here than what we're being told in these few verses. To be sure, the hateful Haman can't handle the fact that Mordecai refuses to bow down to him, and this was just making him crazy. But his ingrained hatred runs much deeper than merely for Mordecai's insolence. Haman wouldn't have it in for the entire population of the Jews if the problem lay solely with Mordecai's insubordination. His hatred for the Jews may have been a generational thing. If he was an Agagite, and verse 1 says he was, then all of his ancestors may have had a major problem with the Jews. You'll recall that Mordecai and Queen Esther were of the royal line of King Saul, and we learn in verse 1 of this chapter that Haman was an Agagite, a descendant of the Amalekite king Agag. Now with that in mind, let's go back to 1 Samuel 15 and read a few verses there to set the stage for what's going on here with Haman. Turn back there if you'd like to follow along. 1 Samuel 15, beginning in verse 1. 1 Samuel 15:1. Samuel said to Saul, "I am the one the Lord sent to anoint you king over his people Israel. So listen now to the message from the Lord. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt." Now what the Amalekites did was attack the Israelites who couldn't keep up with the rest. They were the older people that were the children who weren't able to defend themselves, and they were the stragglers, the weak ones. This is who the Amalekites went after. Verse 3. Now go, attack the Amalekites, and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. So Saul summoned the men and mustered them at Telaim, 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 from Judah. Verse 5, Saul went to the city of Amalek and set an ambush in the ravine. Skip down to verse 7. Then Saul attacked the Amalekites all the way from Havilah to Shur, near the eastern border of Egypt. He took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive, and all his people he totally destroyed with the sword. But Saul and the army spared Agag and the best of the sheep and cattle, the fat calves, the lambs, everything that was good. These they were unwilling to destroy completely, but everything that was despised and weak they totally destroyed. Now skip down to verse 32. Then Samuel said, Bring me Agag, the king of the Amalekites. Agag came to him in chains, and he thought, "Surely the bitterness of death is past." But Samuel said, "As your sword has made women childless, so will your mother be childless among women." And Samuel put Agag to death before the Lord at Gilgal. Okay, the Amalekites always hated the Jews and the Israelites, and they were always a major thorn in the side of Israel. And if you're Haman, you know this story of how Saul decimated his ancestors, and Samuel executed Agag, king of the Amalekites. Haman was of the royal line of Agag. It may not have been this particular Agag, because according to the John Gill commentary, Agag was a common name for all the kings of Amalek, like Pharaoh or Artaxerxes. It was just a title. But you might be asking yourself, I thought Saul completely destroyed the Amalekites. It says so in 1 Samuel 15:20. Okay, well, let's read that, beginning in verse 18. 1 Samuel 15:18. This is Samuel confronting Saul. Verse 18. "And he sent you on a mission, saying, Go and completely destroy those wicked people, the Amalekites. Wage war against them until you have wiped them out." Verse 19. "Why did you not obey the Lord? Why did you pounce on the plunder and do evil in the eyes of the Lord?" "But I did obey the Lord," Saul said. "I went on the mission the Lord assigned me. I completely destroyed the Amalekites. I brought back Agag, their king." Well, maybe Saul did believe he completely destroyed them, but in reality, he didn't. There continued to be pockets of Amalekites in various places. David had to deal with the Amalekites in 1 Samuel 30 when they raided his camp at Ziklag. The Amalekites burned Ziklag and kidnapped all the women and children, including David's 2 wives. Now, David and his wife went after them and defeated the Amalekites and took everything that was worth taking, and they recovered the women and the children safely, but it doesn't say he destroyed them all. Their defeat is mentioned again in 2 Samuel 1 and verse 1. And the last time we hear about the Amalekites it's in 1 Chronicles 4:43, where it says this. And this happened in the days of King Hezekiah, which was about 300 years after King David and about 200 years before this episode of Haman and Mordecai. Let me begin reading verse 42. 1 Chronicles 4:42. "And 500 of these Simeonites, led by Pelatiah, Neariah, Rephaiah, Uzziel, the sons of Ishi, invaded the hill country of Seir. They killed the remaining Amalekites who had escaped, and they've lived there to this day." Now, if you have a pronoun problem like I do, you might think that this means the Amalekites have lived there to this day, but it means the Simeonites conquered them, and the Simeonites are living there to this day. So, what can we conclude about Haman's ancestry? Well, if he was in fact a descendant of one of the Agags, that is, one of the Amalekite kings, then I think it's safe to assume that one or more of his ancestors must have escaped, whether it was an individual, a family, or even a small outlying community. But if you're Haman, and your ancestors were virtually annihilated by the armies of Israel, then you have a pretty good reason to hate the Jews, and especially Mordecai, because of his direct lineage to King Saul. Not that Mordecai had anything to do with any of that. Still, forgive and forget wasn't in the mindset of Haman. Well, let's move on to verse 7. But this is as good a time as any to take a short break, so we'll take one. Here's Gary.
The most dangerous kind of sin, whether it be your own or that of someone else, is the hidden sin, the sin you cannot see. For a free program titled The Hidden Sin, write to Born to Win, Post Office Box 560, White House, Texas 75791. Or call toll-free 1-888-BIBLE-44.
We're back. Verse 7. Up to this point, Haman had been plotting and conniving and planning the logistics of wiping out Mordecai's people. And we can't know how much time this took to put his evil little plan together, but when we get to verse 7, it seems he must have solidified the plan, and now he needs to discern via divinery which would be the right day to carry out this atrocity. Okay, verse 7, Esther 3:7. In the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, the pur, that is, the lot, was cast in the presence of Haman to select a day and a month. And the lot fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar. This was 4 years and a couple of months since the marriage of Esther to King Darius. So what's going on with this casting of the lot here? Here's what the Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown commentary says about verse 7. In the first month they cast pur, that is, the lot. In resorting to this method of, and this is a quote by the way, in resorting to this method of ascertaining the most auspicious day for putting his atrocious scheme into execution, Haman acted as kings and nobles of Persia have always done, never engaging in any enterprise without consulting the astrologers and being satisfied as to the lucky hour. Vowing revenge but scorning to lay hands on a single victim, he meditated the extirpation of the whole Jewish race, who, he knew, were sworn enemies of his countrymen, and by artfully representing them as a people who were aliens in manners and habits, and enemies to the rest of his subjects, he procured the king's sanction of the intended massacre. One motive which he used in urging his point was addressed to the king's cupidity, or greed, fearing lest his master might object that the extermination of a numerous body of his subjects would seriously depress the public revenue. Haman promised to make up the loss. End quote. Verse 8. And note in this verse how Haman seeks to divide and misrepresent the Jews as being apart from the norm and disobedient to the king's laws. Verse 8. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, There is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom, who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of the other people, and that they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. Now, doesn't this sound remarkably like the misrepresentations of the Jews down through history? It's always the same story, isn't it? The Jewish people are always hated by some people, and often by people who have influence or authority of some sort. And then they have to make up illegitimate excuses why they should be persecuted, shunned, or even worse. They perpetuate the big lie. Tell a lie, tell it often, and before long the masses they'll believe it. The masses will believe it. And at some point, the demonic mob mentality takes over. We see this from time to time, most recently in Washington, D.C. during the weekend after President Trump's inauguration. Maybe you watched the felonious rioters destroy storefronts and set fires to cars. And then there was the obscene women's march on Washington. That was a prime example of idiotic mob mentality. Verse 9. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administration for the royal treasury. This is how Haman appealed to the king's greed. The demise of so many people would most assuredly have a detrimental effect on the royal treasury, so he offered to give the king a huge amount of silver from his own personal fortune to make up for the loss of revenue. The Barnes commentary says this about that amount of money. Quote, according to Herodotus, the regular revenue of the Persian king consisted of about 14,560 silver talents, so that if the same talent is intended, Haman's offer would have exceeded 2/3 of 1 year's revenue, or 2.5 million British pounds sterling. End quote. Verse 10. So the king took his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. Verse 11. Keep the money, the king said to Haman, and do with the people as you please. The king didn't want Haman's money. Maybe it was out of generosity. Maybe his pride kept him from taking it. Or maybe he didn't want to be beholden to Haman in any way. We can't really know, but it wasn't about the money for the king. Maybe it was a way for him to ease any guilt he may have had in giving in to Haman, and maybe he considered it blood money. This whole scenario reminds me of the time Daniel was framed by his covetous co-workers in Babylon. Remember? Let's look back in chapter 6 of Daniel, and let's begin reading in chapter 6, or verse 1 of chapter 6 of Daniel. Daniel 6:1. It pleased Darius. Now remember, this is Darius the Mede, not Esther's Darius. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities, the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, "We'll never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God." So these administrators and satraps went as a group to the king and said, "May King Darius live forever." The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered, in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. So Darius put the decree in writing. Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room, where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. "Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days anyone who prays to any god or human being except to you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den?" The king answered, "The decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed." Then they said to the king, "Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day." When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. Then the men went as a group to King Darius and said, "Remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed." So why would this Darius do this? Why would he have signed that decree? And why would Esther's Darius agree to let Haman kill all the Jews in Persia? You have to wonder. In the case of Darius the Mede, he hadn't been king of Babylon all that long. Cyrus made him king right after Babylon had been conquered, so he must have had a lot of things going on in his new administration. And he probably trusted his advisors and wasn't even thinking about how Daniel was going to be affected. Darius liked Daniel. He wouldn't have signed anything that would have brought harm on him. But in the case of Darius the Great Artaxerxes, maybe Haman carried a huge amount of sway and influence on the king. He was the king's closest advisor, and he had great personal wealth, which would be an indication of his would-be power. And maybe the king thought Haman had good reason to carry this out. Kings want their subjects to be obedient and loyal, and according to Haman, they weren't obedient to the king, and they lived by their own rules. And maybe that was enough to threaten the king's ego. Verse 12. Then on the 13th day of the first month, the royal secretaries were summoned. They wrote out in the script of each province and in the language of each peoples all Haman's orders to the king's satraps, the governors of the various provinces, and the nobles of the various peoples. These were written in the name of King Xerxes himself and sealed with his own ring. Verse 13. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. Verse 14. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality, so they would be ready for that day. The couriers went out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered. So the wheels are now in motion for the total obliteration of the Jews, and it was going to happen in about 12 months. Haman must have been delirious with delight, and apparently the king was at peace with his plan too, and so it's happy hour for Haman and the king. You may have noticed the number 13 popped up a couple of times in the planning stages of this debacle. Actually, it pops up throughout the Bible. My friend William Struess, whom I've referenced in previous studies, has even written a book on this very subject, and it's titled The 13th Enumeration, and he has a blog with the same name. I'd like to read an interesting entry to his blog, which touches on these events in Esther. His blog post is titled April Fools, and I quote, "Have you ever wondered about the history of April Fools? Well, the origins of this tradition may date back to the common history of two nations which are still in the news today. By some accounts, Israel and Iran are at the brink of war, and events seem to be spiraling out of control. The history and dynamics surrounding the relationships of these two nations is fascinating, and could well be the basis for the tradition of April Fools. The term Nowruz, it's spelled Nowruz, means literally new light, and is the name of the Persian New Year celebration, which lasts 12 days. It is celebrated in the spring and is closely related to the spring equinox. Historians say it's been celebrated for at least 3,000 years, and it's a joyous time of visiting family and friends. Still quoting, "On the 13th day of the new year, the Persian people celebrate Sizdah Bedar. Sizdah Bedar literally means getting rid of 13. It is often associated with bad luck and ill omen. Many Persian families spend the day in the countryside, It's so widely celebrated that some towns seem deserted on that day. The tradition can be traced as far back as the 6th century BC. It's also celebrated in Iraq, Azerbaijan, Central Asia, and Armenia. On this day, Persians play practical jokes on each other, and some claim it's the basis for April Fool's Day. It's interesting to note that Sizdah Bedar is strangely absent from much of the Persian history after it became part of the Muslim world in the 7th century. About the same time Sizdah Bedar is first noticed historically in Persian culture, the very same day is recorded as a day of infamy in biblical tradition. In the book of Esther, a Persian named Haman conceives a plan to destroy the Jewish people. As part of his preparations, he starts casting pur, or lots, in the first month of Nisan, of the 12th year of the Persian king Ahasuerus. It's just another name for Artaxerxes. He continues with this ritual for 12 months. Then, in the first month, the 13th month from when it began, in the 13th year of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the month, the king makes Haman's plan to destroy all the Jews of the kingdom. He makes it law. This day was Sizdah Bedar, the very same day which Persians for the last 2,500 years have associated with bad luck. Still quoting, "Those familiar with the book of Esther know that the date for the extermination of the Jewish people was set for the 13th day of the 12th month of the 13th year of King Ahasuerus. It was through the courage of Queen Esther and her intervention on behalf of her people that a day meant for the destruction of the Jewish people instead became a day of destruction for their enemies. For over 2,500 years, the 13th through the 15th of Adar is remembered as a day of deliverance for the Jewish people in their celebration of Purim. Ironic, isn't it, that Sizdah Bedar, the day of getting rid of 13, was the day Haman was given permission to get rid of a nation of people who, it could be argued, consisted of 13 tribes. So next time April comes around, give a thought to one of the greatest April fools of all time. Consider a man who had determined evil upon a whole race of people, ended up reaping what he had sown. April fools indeed." End quote. I thought that was an interesting observation, and it's one that I hadn't heard before. And that's the end of chapter 3. This chapter ends with Haman and the king kicking back and enjoying a few drinks. But the people in Shushan who've received the news of the impending doom, they're perplexed. They're perplexed because the edict doesn't ring true to the people of the city. The Jews weren't causing any problems, and they weren't in rebellion to the king. But what no one sees is the dark, swirling storms of an unimaginable spiritual battle looming overhead. The archangel Gabriel already told Daniel that he had to do battle with the prince of Persia prior to meeting with Daniel. And it was a battle that lasted 3 weeks. We can't grasp what that must have been like. And we can't even begin to fathom the evil power that's been unleashed on all the provinces of the Persian Empire at this point in the lives of Mordecai, Esther, and all the Jews there. Unbeknownst to Mordecai and Esther, this spiritual battle has been in the works for some time, and they're only finding out about it now. Or I should say, in the next chapter, chapter 4. But that will have to wait for next week, as we're flat out of time for tonight. Thank you very much for joining us again tonight. We hope you'll come back again and again as we continue to explore the life and times of Queen Esther. Please email me if you have any questions or comments, and you can email me at richg@borntowin.net. That's richg@borntowin.net. Hope to hear from you, and be sure to let us know where you are. We'd really like to know where you call home. Thanks again for listening in. Have a magnificent week, and we hope to see you again here next week at the Weekend Bible Study. Good night, everyone.